Ian, thanks for coming in today. You're the executive director of the Gracepoint Foundation. Could you tell us a little bit about what the Gracepoint Foundation does and what your mission is?
For sure. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share today with your audience. The Gracepoint Foundation is the philanthropic arm of Gracepoint, which is one of the largest behavioral health organizations in all of West Florida and in all of the state as well. The Gracepoint Foundation, what our mission is to get out and spread awareness about mental health, talk about with business communities and community partners about the importance of mental health, raise money in the community for programs we have at Gracepoint, and also share what's going on in terms of services that we provide at Gracepoint, which right now serves more than 30,000 people in our community.
Well, that's incredible. And you guys are the biggest, but you've been around for a while.
We have been around for a while. We actually celebrated our 70th anniversary last year, so we're 71 years in.
So that's 1949.
The Tampa Bay community, that's 1949, and we've consistently grown in terms of scope and size of our programs and services that we offer the community. But right now, we're really best known for being Hillsborough County's mental health, behavioral health emergency room.
Got it. And so under that, my understanding is you have 25 different programs. Would you mind going into just help us understand the spectrum of things that you provide?
In addition to being, having what we call the crisis centers for both children and adults on our campus, the 25 programs really do run the gamut in terms of scope and size. We have homeless case management programs, homeless housing programs, assisted living and assisted supportive and affordable housing programs as well. A number of programs in terms of targeted case management to help families in need, plus a very robust both crisis, inpatient, and outpatient services for children and adults. And that's predominantly where a majority of our people that come to Gracepoint are served in those programs.
Wow. And you so there's a lot of people that you're touching through those programs, right? So 30,000?
Over 30,000. Over 30,000.
That includes the families of those involved in everything?
Well, it's unique because you can come as, somebody who's served through one of our crisis programs, but then we try to make sure there's a soft handoff to one of the other programs that we offer, whether that's case management, whether that's outpatient services. So you can get served in a number of different ways when you come to Gracepoint for help, whether it's behavioral health related, whether it's addiction related. And so it's not just come and have crisis help, get stabilized, and leave. We want to make sure that we're helping anybody that comes there in the best way that we can. And if that requires to hand you off to another program that's best for you, we try to make that happen.
Wow, that sounds like a super important mission. What inspired you, Ian Adair, to get involved with Gracepoint? Because my understanding is this is your third
organization, yeah.
Third. So you are an established, successful leader of nonprofit organizations. What was it about Gracepoint that drew you to them?
It really was the mission and my personal connection to mental health and addiction. I'm very open and honest about it. My family has a very close connection with my brother and my mother, both having suicide attempts between them, both struggling with mental illness. And then as I took care of them, I found out later in life, as many people do when you get in your early 20s, I started experiencing my own mental health challenges as well with depression and anxiety. And I think when we start to feel that way, like most people, I didn't want to tell anybody. So my mother has passed away a long time ago, and I never even told her that I was suffering because of, I think as human beings, we rank each other's pain, especially when it comes to taking care of our loved ones. And so I ranked what I was going through and my suffering lower than hers. And then it wasn't until after I sought help and got more educated that I realized that probably wasn't the best route for me and my wellness, but that's just what we did. So although I didn't say anything for those first 36, 37 years, 10 years later, I'm 46 years old now. It seems like I don't stop talking about it. I'm more than happy to share and talk about it. So it really was my personal connection to what Gracepoint does in terms of supporting those in crisis and then also helping those that just need help in general with addiction and other mental health challenges. That brought me to the Gracepoint Foundation.
And so you just brought up, not telling people, right? Yeah. Like, what is that? What do you think that number one thing is that causes people to not share.
And we all know it, and that's the deal. We've identified it. It's one word. It's stigma, and that prevents people who need help to seek the help that they really do need. And right now, research is telling us that stigma actually, in terms of timeline, is onset of feeling something, can take most people up to 8 to 10 years before they seek help with a mental health condition. And that means there's a decade of people suffering out there, suffering right now, that aren't seeking help because of the stigma that they have of disclosing what they're going through, disclosing a mental illness, disclosing an addiction challenge. And that's something we have to stop, because that would never prevent you or me or anybody else out there from seeking help for a physical ailment or physical condition, but it does impact and get in the way of seeking help for mental health illness.
Sure. Well, it's kind of interesting, because we're talking about something super serious, and like you're full of energy talking about, preventing suicide and things like that. And that's probably coming out because you're making a difference.
I hope we are. I hope everybody is. There's so many good people talking about it. There's so many great agencies addressing it, and yet we've all recognized that we need more help. We need more activists and mental health champions and advocates out there, because too many people are suffering. Way too many people are suffering. It has a huge impact, not just on families, on the economy, but there's just so much going on. And everyone I know, no matter how many people I talk to, no matter how big the audience is, whether it was in person like it was last year or virtual like it is today, I always ask the group to kind of start the conversation. Who in the room or who on the Zoom call has been impacted by mental illness, addiction, or suicide? And across the board, 95% or greater raise their hand, stand up, or click a button on a Zoom call now for a reaction.
Asking for a friend, right?
It's safe. And once you do that, and once everyone sees that, now the room is a little bit different. Now you have that collective sigh of relief, that deep breath to say, I'm in a safe place to talk about it. I'm in a safe place to listen more about it, to connect with people that have a shared story. And the whole conversation gets a little bit differently. And that's how I like to say it's the best way to address stigma. You got to create a safe environment first to do it.
So obviously you have a new book out.
Yes.
Right? Stronger Than Stigma?
Stronger Than Stigma. And I believe the Stronger Than Stigma, it was based off an event that we started at the foundation a couple years ago, the success we had the event, where we had speakers get up and tell their story. But where we found we had the most success was when we had people from our local community also share a little bit about their connection to the mission, whether it was a connection through being a caregiver, whether it was a connection having a mental health challenge themselves or an addiction challenge. And we found our audience really gravitated to those stories. So in a time where you can't be around people anymore, and you can't have these big events anymore, we decided to take on this project where we would reach out. Some people had already communicated to us they're willing to share their story, and let's put.
So they were survivors.
They were survivors in a number of different ways, because I would say I call them all survivors and I call them all champions, but they had a strong connection to the mission. They might have had somebody in their immediate family die by suicide. They might have cared for somebody in their family that had an addiction challenge. They might have had one themselves. And so these stories, these 12 stories shared in this book, 9 of these stories are local community leaders who are very successful, who were sharing sometimes for the first time in this kind of format, their connection to the mission, their management of their mental illness or addiction, or the story of what happened to them and what motivated them to want to help other people when they lost somebody themselves.
Well, that's a powerful thing. Is it these stories, hearing about these stories, what is the main thing that does? Is it the feeling of not being alone? Is that a big problem?
It is. I think for anyone who's experiencing anything, especially when you experience it for the first time, you automatically default, I believe, to feeling like it's only happening to you.
Sure.
I know that's the way I felt. I know that's the way hundreds of people that I talk to when I go to conferences or when I speak, who reach out to me. Everyone always describes a lot of the same type of early feelings, and then there's a fear there. I think mental health, mental illness, and addiction has gotten easier for some people to talk about or openly talk about or discuss. I mean, we see it's trending on social media a lot.
Sure.
It's in the news a lot, but it's usually associated with something negative, whether it's a mass shooting, and we start talking about mental health and gun laws, but then we usually it gets out later that most violent crime is only committed by 4% of people with mental health, a diagnosed mental health condition.
Oh, wow.
So there's not a real correlation there, but mental health always becomes a point of discussion when that happens, or when we see a shooting in a school, and we usually learn about a student having mental health issues or challenges that came out later that we learn about. High profile suicides that you hear about. And 6 years ago, one of the very first ones that really made the national media attention was Robin Williams. Over the last 3-4
Right.
years, you've seen Anthony Bourdain
Right.
and Kate Spade and other people in other walks of life, whether it's
Extremely successful
successful
Right.
business people, entrepreneur people, performing artists. And I think that group of people, the group that we kind of give a little bit of air cover to,
Sure.
that group it's gotten easier for. Because I think as people who aren't in the public eye,
Yeah, like Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah,
He almost like broke the ice back then, right?
Yeah, well, he openly talks about his issues with addiction. And I think
We just watched Rocket Man last weekend, the movie, and
Right.
in that movie, Elton John struggles with alcoholism and every drug known to
Right.
man and sexism and everything else, right?
and it's more accepted to hear those stories from people in the
Right.
public eye. Where we still need help, where we still need to work on, is everyday people, and that's students, especially students, that's working professionals, that's retired seniors, because for that group, there's still a fear of losing the three things that matter the most in your life, and that's your family, your friends, and your job. And so that's where we really need to do the most work when we talk about and address issues of stigma, and when we talk about mental health.
So it's the fear of putting one of those three things at risk.
It really is, and I think, and that's usually why, going back to your earlier statement of, do people feel alone, and then they take this on themselves, and then when they start to conceptualize it a little bit more, they look at what they could lose if they say something, not the help and the wellness they could gain if they reach out to somebody.
Sure. So is that getting easier for people? I mean, obviously we're seeing that with celebrities. I mean, what is the climate of mental health right now, and people coming out and asking for help if they need it?
It really is. It's getting easier for that, because we see more athletes, professional athletes, coming out about it, and that's great, because that continues the conversation, and I think that allows the topic to come up more and more. Where I still think we need help is the everyday people. I think what's going to do that? It's not a news story is not going to do that. I think we got to start where we spend a majority of our time, and that's at work, or that's at school for some folks. And so if we can change the climate there and make those spaces safe, then I think people will know they're not alone. I think people will be encouraged to get the help they need. I think once they're encouraged to get the help, their organizations and companies will work with them so that they become a more productive and loyal and more engaged employee. And that's what we all want.
Okay, so that's one of the three things, right? Jobs.
Right.
So if you're somebody who's struggling with mental health problem, or something's going on that you're really it's stressing you out deeply, you may feel a little nervous about bringing that up, right? So what are some things that companies and entrepreneurs what are some things that they can do to create more of a mental health wellness environment? I mean, you were talking about the violent crime, 4%.
Right.
So what are some things that we can do to make sure that 4% perhaps takes better care of their mental health, or recognizes they need help early on?
Well, I think we realize right away when we become adults, we spend more time at work than anywhere else.
Sure.
And then since we spend so much time at work, the number one thing I hear from companies and organizations, knowing that the employees and attracting top talent, what they're asking for is those employees are asking for companies that they want to feel connected to the company's mission. They want those companies that have access to top technology, flexible work schedule, but they really want them to care about mental health and wellness as well. And there's lots of things that companies can do. I think for the longest time, being 46 and being a Gen Xer, the leaders that I had, they were all about, all right, work hard to get to the next level of pay, to get to the next level or the next title, whatever that is on the door on your business card. You're always moving to one of those two things. 70% of the workforce now is millennial or Gen Z. Mm-hmm. And they're not asking for that. They're actually valuing those other things like mentorship, professional development, wellness, higher than they're valuing pay and job title. So if companies know that, there are some things that they can do to jump in right away that can let employees know just that they do care about them. And those things are really low cost to no cost to incorporate.
Well, I mean, my own personal experience, I was working at an agency 15 years ago, and my life was awesome, right? And I was married, had a child, and then all of a sudden, like, next thing I know, I'm going through a divorce, right? Well, one of the benefits that I wasn't paying any attention to before that started happening was they had a hotline you could call, right? And so as soon as I found out that I was experiencing that, I was able to call that hotline. And one of the things that the HR part of the company explained was that, hey, if you're having problems, whatever, you can call this. We don't even know about it. So like I felt safe to do it because I didn't feel like it put my my job at risk. Right. I mean, so if you're in line for promotion, you might be very scared, to come forward with like, hey, I'm dealing with this really challenging thing, right? Because you don't want your employer to think you're damaged goods. But that benefit was extremely useful to me.
Yeah, I think what you're probably describing is an employee assistance program. Mm-hmm. And an EAP program is something that is very beneficial to folks, especially now. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people have some preconceived notions about employee assistance programs because they're run by HR. They think it's tracked. Yeah. But again, it's confidential. It's not something it's something that's not tracked. And I think employers need to do a better job of explaining EAP programs a little bit so more people can utilize them. That's definitely one of the things that I recommend organizations put in place.
So I should ask my employment provider or to look into it?
Definitely talk to HR department. Say, have you looked into an EAP program, especially if you manage a lot of people, because it could be a benefit to them and it could be an add-on that you can add at a low cost if you already have a large insurance provider because you're providing benefits for several employees. That's definitely one of the things that you can do that has a small cost associated with it. But there's a lot of things that I encourage employers to do that have no cost associated with it. And fortunately for mental health, we have days and awareness days all over the calendar.
So no cost. These are things that employment providers can do at no expense.
Right away. And just, and I think when I talk about a lot of these things, I say, obviously you want them to have an impact, but what you're really trying to do, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit, is create a safe space for conversations to happen. Because if people feel alone, they don't want to talk about it. If they feel fear of losing their job, they don't want to talk about it. So if you can create an environment that's inclusive to talking about mental health awareness and addiction, that changes the game. And that can be as easy as both having an environment in person and online. A lot of organizations have an intranet or an inter-office, whether using Slack or Yammer or some kind of inter-office board where you can share information about things going on. Like I said, mental health has days all over.
So you mentioned 4 things. So what are the 4 things?
So let's all right. The 4 things kind of in order would be make sure your employees know it's safe for them to discuss mental health. That's first and foremost. How do you do that? Well, let's look at what vehicles and communication platforms do you have at your disposal, both internally and externally. Just so you know, there's an opportunity to say, hey, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, guys. We're going to support this in our organization, and we're going to educate people in our employee base about mental health because we want them to feel safe here in case somebody is experiencing something or caring for somebody with a challenge themselves. We got to go back to that first question that I ask everybody. Raise your hand or stand up if you have a connection to it. Just by knowing the answer is such a high percentage, we know that there's got to be, no matter how many employees you have, whether it's 10, 30, or 130.
So just helping everybody know that it's safe.
It's safe. And you do that by the leadership sharing whatever that is. There is a Mental Health Awareness Month. There is a Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. There's a Suicide Prevention Month. There's a World Mental Health Day that was just 2 weeks ago. So just opportunities just naturally on the calendar, not to force it, but naturally on the calendar to say, we're going to educate our folks and we're going to have it, make sure that people know this is a safe space for them.
Okay.
The second thing is, and requires leadership effort, is sharing stories across all levels. And it usually requires leadership setting the precedent first. So if you're somebody that has a connection to mental health, addiction, or suicide, just sharing your connection with it, because when leaders are vulnerable and share their personal experience or their lived experience, meaning that they're living with a mental health condition or an active recovery, when leadership is vulnerable, it helps create transparency and acceptance amongst the entire workplace. And then I think for most people, once shared stories are out there, it's easier to disclose when something's happening to you, and it makes that disclosure easier to your manager or to your CEO because they've been vulnerable and shared with you as well. So you know it's something that they care about. So it makes it easier for you to get the help that you need.
Okay.
So that's two. The other thing I like to always bring up is there's a great training out there that's mostly free. So the third thing I always talk about is educating employees and managers about recognizing mental illness. And it's called Mental Health First Aid, and it's usually offered for free. It's a one-day training, 8 hours, and you can walk away by getting your managers or your leadership.
So this is in-person training?
It's in-person training. I'm pretty sure they can do it virtually now, but it's just a one-day training where anybody can walk away after that 8 hours certified in mental health first aid. Doesn't mean you're doesn't mean you're a counselor. Doesn't mean you're a therapist. Don't open. You can't say you're taking copays now because you're a therapist. But what it does is it trains people on recognizing signs, and that's what's really beneficial in the workplace, when you can recognize an employee that's not acting like themselves, that's interacting differently or not engaged. And it gives you that confidence to say, what's going on? Let's talk about it. I'm here for you. We're going to go have a private conversation or a private Zoom call. I know a lot of people are like, well, I can't have those conversations. I'm like, you can. Yeah. You just got to make the effort to do it individually.
Okay.
And then the last thing is just make wellness a priority. We all talk about work-life balance and whether it exists or not. We talked about establishing an EAP program. I think wellness programs in general create a fun camaraderie and competitiveness in the office. And wellness, whether it's physical wellness, is very much in correlation to mental wellness. So if you make wellness a priority, then it all becomes natural in how it goes together, and just to create the environment you want in the workplace.
So one thing you just mentioned, by the way, those are 4 awesome things, and you're right, they're basically free. Right. So it just takes a little bit of energy, and you make it a priority, and it's something that you can do in the workplace. One thing you just mentioned was a private Zoom call. So this show is called The Law of Relevancy. It's about things that are happening now. There's a lot of Zoom calls going on. Right. I think I spend about 3 to 5 hours a day on Zoom calls now, or Teams calls or whatever, but I think they're all called Zoom calls now, right? Is mental health something that you can receive treatment for virtually?
Oh, yes. I think it's one of the best things about advances in therapy is telehealth medicine, or telehealth has gotten very, very popular. I think we were moving in that direction prior to COVID and social distancing and everything going on. Now we have actually jumped into almost completely virtual health in a number of different ways. At Gracepoint itself was about 15% of our outpatient therapy was what we'd call telehealth. And then immediately, into the precautions and the restrictions through COVID, we had to go from 15% to almost 99% overnight.
Oh, wow.
And so we want to make sure, and I think telehealth has a lot of advantages that some people would probably never have thought before. We get used to Zoom calls and we get used to virtual meetings. Telemedicine has been beneficial for a number of reasons, because a lot of times there's barriers for people to actually physically get somewhere. Especially if you're below the poverty level, whether it's the ability to take off work and to have a flexible work schedule to support your mental health needs. That's usually one thing that telehealth really helps with. It's just transportation. We're talking basic things that I think.
And if you're fighting it, you're going to use any excuse.
Right. I think we talk about all the time in mental health, acknowledging that you need to get help is the first major hurdle.
Yeah.
Setting up an appointment or finding a provider, a caregiver is another one. But then actually physically showing up is that third one. Telehealth really helps kind of soften that last couple of barriers to where you say, okay, I can actually get the help I need in the privacy of my own home, in the comfort of my own home, and maybe not go somewhere where I miss preconceived notions or kind of like some myths that really aren't valid, but in my head, this is what a mental health facility looks like.
Sure.
In my head, this is what sitting down with a therapist looks like. So with telehealth, I think it kind of goes through those misconceptions and really gets into really helping and connecting with the person where they feel the safest.
Wow, that's really good to know. I mean, I would say that if there's any one thing that's happened since March, that is very, very positive with going through COVID, I would think it would be telehealth.
It really is. And I think in terms of using Zoom calls to initiate those conversations as managers and supervisors and leaders with your staff, I know for the longest time, the conversation was when they're at work, they need to be at work, and it's not my job to interfere in their mental health. But, when you flip that around on organizations, the number one reason for absenteeism and loss of productivity in the workplace is mental health.
Well, I mean,
and so once they recognize how it affects their balance sheet, and then the conversation becomes a little bit different, and you have to start looking at those things you would have never thought about before, which are flexible work schedule and working around people's needs.
Well, I would think the more thinking that's involved in a job, the more that mental health could interfere with the productivity, right? It's probably in your best interest from a productivity standpoint to really care.
And battling a mental health condition affects you considerably physically as well. So it's not just if you're suffering from profound grief and loss and you're a laborer, you're not laboring very well.
That's a good point.
So there's just a lot of connection there that we now know that we didn't know before, that we have to get out to employers and say, if you want to lower absenteeism, if you want to increase productivity, you might have to change your mindset of what it looks like to take care of your people and include this, because the benefits vastly outweigh anything that you might think in your mind is a negative. So,
okay. So let's say you're someone who needs, you're having thoughts, you think maybe I need to get some help, or like you're something along those lines, right? So what is the one thing you would say to them that would help them cross that line to actually seek help?
I think there's two ways to approach that. One, if somebody discloses to you, a friend, family member, I think the first thing I always tell people they need to remember is it's not your job to try to fix somebody.
Right.
I know as friends and as family, we want to take care of it's human nature. We want to jump in and fix as much as we can or make suggestions. I think when people disclose a mental health or an addiction challenge, they just need you to listen, and I need you to end that conversation with, I believe you. Not say it'll be better tomorrow. Not
so listen and I believe you.
I in almost every single talk with the best response you can say is I believe you. I think the other part of that is if you notice somebody who looks like they're really struggling, whether it is on a Zoom call, whether it is in person, whether they're not engaged, whether they're not interactive, they might look a little more disheveled. They might not look like they're grooming themselves as much. We can tell when people aren't getting enough sleep. And these are all signs. And so we need to be able to have the confidence to pull those people aside and say, what's going on? I'm here if you need someone to talk to. Let's talk about this. And, sometimes people fear.
And that would be peer-to-peer or manager to employee? It doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I think we're all leaders. I think sometimes we look in the workforce as, well, the CEO is the leader. But, when we make the conscious decision to be a leader, when we look to the person to the left of us, the person to the right of us, and know that we got their back when they need us. Right. We do that all the time with our teams. I mean, it's funny when I talk to people who are mid-managers, like, well, I don't know really if I'm a leader, Ian. Like, well, are you leading people every day? Yes. Are you leading volunteers sometimes every day? Yes. All right. Do you lead sometimes committees? Well, yes. You're a leader.
Right.
And if you take the time to care about the people around you, you're a leader. You don't have to have CEO or COO or CFO next to your name. You're a leader if you do those things. And I think, no matter who it is, As long as when you're confident to reach out to somebody and just say, what's going on? You don't seem like yourself. Is there anything I can do to help? And I think once you get that discussion going, once you create that safe space for them to disclose, again, not our job to fix, then it's our job to say, maybe let's steer them in the direction of talking to a professional, or let's steer them in the direction of an employee assistance program.
So would you mind if we talk about the book for a minute?
Yeah, let's talk. Yeah, I'm excited.
So in the book, there are 12 stories.
Yeah.
And so if somebody were to open that up, you would see these people who are leaders in the community, right? Recognized leaders in the community who have struggled either personally or family, people around them. Were there any stories in that book that especially touched you?
God, they all do in some way, because when you have people willing to speak to their profound grief and loss, and it usually has to do with losing somebody to suicide, losing somebody to abuse or murder. These are some of the stories that are represented in this book.
So is that a main trigger? Profound grief and loss?
Anytime we lose somebody close to us, one of the things that we can experience as human beings is just overwhelming grief and loss. And I think that is something that can disrupt us. Our normal day, and it can disrupt our workflow, it can disrupt our thinking process. And when the book is designed in a way to not just tell their stories and I do it in the first person, because after conversations and interviews and follow-up conversations, I'm telling the story from the first person. Each opening paragraph, opening chapter of each story really expresses why that person's there. It really speaks to them finding out they just lost somebody. It speaks to them talking about having suicidal thoughts, or what we call suicide ideation. It speaks to them learning for the first time that someone that they care about just died by suicide, or that somebody they care about passed away due to an addiction. And then it kind of goes into their process of how they dealt with those emotions, or how they're managing their mental illness. And that's what's so tough about mental illness. It's one of the most treatable illnesses out there, but it's everyday management. And that's the stuff that it's not talked about enough, because that requires a lot of work. And so that's what this book kind of goes through. It's
probably uncomfortable
for
work
each person. Oh, it's completely uncomfortable work, because you can still be on what we call a path to wellness and still be in active recovery and still have very bad days. It's easier sometimes in the philanthropic world when we run or race for the cure for something, or when we see somebody ring a bell, and that to us is a finality of the end of something.
Sure.
With mental illness, that doesn't end. It's managed. It's managed through therapy. It's managed through medication. It's managed through self-care. And so it's that everyday management with which at any point, anyone can get triggered to take a step back, or anyone can have a bad day, or anybody can, feel like they're going really well and then something else happens that puts us in a state of grief. So it's that everyday stuff that sometimes is a hard stuff to talk about. It's stuff that's not addressed, I think, in popular culture or in movies. But that's what these people were willing to do, and that's what makes this book so powerful.
I was reading an excerpt from the book, and one of the things that I've felt or impacted me significantly was one of the stories opened up and it said, about how they went over to their mom's house and they could tell something was wrong. And it was very descriptive about it, just describing the scene. And it just brought me right there, and it just helped me understand the severity of it. And it's one of those things where I think that the book could be very helpful, because it helps provide context of what it might feel like if you are experiencing this, right? If you have the opportunity to recognize that maybe someone around you or yourself is impacted with something right now, then, what would it look like? It helps you imagine what would happen if you don't seek help.
And I think that's the power of storytelling. I mean, mental health for the longest time, I believe, has had a PR problem. It just, we hit everyone with all these statistics, and we hit everyone with all these numbers, but that doesn't really move anyone experiencing anything to get help. It just describes the outset, what you would call quantitatively what the issue is. I think stories have a way to impact us profoundly. And I think stories have a way for us not only to see the similarities and differences in others, but also see things within ourselves.
Sure.
And so using 12 personal stories, and definitely running, I think, the gambit of mental health and mental illness and addiction with those stories. Really, I think you're not going to find too many people that read it that aren't going to feel a connection to 2 or 3 or more of the people in this book. And I think that's what we have to do to address mental health and addiction today. Is it's not linear. It's just not, this is what somebody going through addiction is experiencing. This is what somebody going through mental illness is experiencing. There's lots of mental illnesses.
Sure.
There's lots of addictions. So what can we do to bring the message, just so people who are experiencing whatever it is they're going through, that true connection? And I think by the time you get done with each story, there's some powerful stuff at play, because we end each story with a call to action.
Okay.
So all these people, ordinary people in themselves, even though many are considered successful, they went through extraordinary circumstances, and now they're spending a majority of their time, each and every one of them, giving back to others, helping others, serving others, sharing their story, and trying to move this conversation forward.
Is this an ongoing project?
It has the ability.
I would imagine that people will be reading this and maybe wanting to share their own story.
That's our hope. It really is. The hope is that the book can really update itself every year, every 2 years. And just keep sharing people willing to tell those stories. I mean, we talk about how it's getting easier for athletes and celebrities and people in the public eye. But only through everyday people sharing their story will it get easier for everyday people. And I think when we look at people who are profiled in this book, and there's some really, well, I would call prominent community leaders profiled in this book.
Sure.
When you look at them, many of us just look at their success or what they've done in their field of expertise, or their title, or their money. And now we're going to look at them as people, and people who processed what they went through and were able to turn that pain into action and hopefully be inspired by it. Because again, when you go back to the 95%, 98% that raise their hand or stand up, a lot of us are like, well, yeah, we have a connection to it, but what can we do? And each of these people gives an example of what's possible to do.
Well, I definitely recommend reading it. So what's next for mental health?
Well, I think continue the conversation and make sure the conversation is as real, as open, as honest as you can make it. And no matter what platform it is, make sure that's a safe platform to have these conversations. Sure. Because right now we know so many people suffering. They're on social media all the time. They're on digital media all the time.
Yeah.
Let's make those spaces positive, and let's turn those platforms, which have become in a lot of ways negative over the last few years.
There's definitely major negative parts of it.
Let's turn them into. There's positive sites out there. There's so many great people who are sharing their story and connecting people on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter.
I totally agree. I mean, one of the places where I think there's actually really good things in social media is when you have communities that are there to support one another. People may be going through the same thing.
Yeah.
And you can find people in those communities that are really encouraging and relatable to what you're dealing with. And if you're not ready to tell somebody, I would think that might be a place where you could connect with others who might be struggling with what you're dealing with. There's one website called Post Secret that I came across. I don't know. I mean, it's very old. It's probably close to 20 years old. But this is a really interesting site because if you scroll through, it's like a blog of images, and people have sent in postcards and handwritten notes, and everyone's anonymous, but they share things that they're struggling with. And you can immediately get this sense of like, hey, I'm not alone when you're reading that site, and experience an incredible amount of empathy for people. I
tell you, when we read a story that connects with us, we kind of become belonging to it, and that's what helps people. I think before, when there wasn't this abundance of information, there wasn't this 24/7, 365 communication overloaded world, we would probably resign into ourselves a little too much. We'd fall back into ourselves and isolate. I think we have the opportunity now to figure out what's out there, how we can help ourselves, the importance of things that we didn't take seriously before, like self-care and management, and time management, and things that say, okay, if I'm spending too much time at work, what can I do to help my own wellness, my own mental health?
Back,
and,
right?
and there's so much of that great information out there, and there's so many people out there really spreading this message of positivity. But it needs to also now translate in what's next for mental health.
Sure.
It needs to now translate into the workplace, because that's where we spend a majority of our time. And now when you have the things that are available at home, and now when you have the workplace involved, I think we start seeing this conversation really take it to another level.
If somebody wants to follow more of what Gracepoint Foundation is doing and what you're doing and what you're up to with raising awareness, where can they follow you and your organization?
The Gracepoint Foundation is very active on social media, whether it's LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter. All they have to do is search Gracepoint Foundation, and one of our accounts will pop up. To follow me, it's really easy. It's just Ian M. Adair. I had to throw in my middle initial because there's I think he's a famous magician in Canada that stole my name, so I couldn't use it. So just Ian M. Adair on Instagram and Twitter. I post, and we post as an organization, information every single day around awareness and education about mental health and addiction. And our goal is just basically one strategy: provide value to anybody and everyone that searches it.
So they don't have to be in Hillsborough County.
They don't have to be in Hillsborough County to look up our information. If you're in Hillsborough County and you're experiencing a crisis, or if you need to talk to somebody, or if your provider says you can't get into a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist right away, please call Gracepoint. We can connect you right away with our outpatient services and get you seeing somebody within a few weeks.
Well, Ian, thanks for coming in. It's an incredible mission that you're part of, and we really appreciate you coming on the Law of Relevancy podcast. And thanks again.
I appreciate the opportunity to share. Thank you for allowing me to have this conversation today.
You're welcome.
Really enjoyed it.